Somewhere above you right now, 4 human beings are traveling at roughly 2,000 miles per hour through a vacuum that will kill them in seconds if anything goes wrong. They cannot open a window. They cannot call for help. The nearest hospital is approximately 250,000 miles away. And here is the part that should stop you cold. They are living better, staying healthier, and communicating more clearly with Earth than any human being who has attempted this journey in the last 53 years. That is not a small contradiction. That is the central paradox of what Artemis II represents. We sent men to the moon in 1969 with computers less powerful than the device you are using to watch this video. Those men survived. They came home. We called it the greatest achievement in human history, and we were not wrong. Then we stopped. For 53 years, not a single human being left low Earth orbit, not once. And in that silence, while we were building the internet and mapping the human genome and teaching machines to think, we were also quietly solving every problem that made deep space so brutally unforgiving the first time. The result is sitting 250,000 miles above your head right now. A spacecraft 20,000 times smarter than Apollo, a crew being monitored at the cellular level, a heat shield that has already raised serious engineering questions that no one has fully resolved, and 4 people who know all of this reviewed all of this and chose to climb in anyway. This is not a repeat of Apollo. It is not a sequel. It is something harder to define and in many ways far more consequential. Because everything this crew experiences over the next 10 days, every anomaly, every data point, every moment their bodies respond to deep space radiation, will directly shape whether human beings ever set foot on Mars. That is what is actually at stake here. So let us begin. December 19th, 1972, Gene Cernan climbs the ladder of the lunar module for the last time, looks back at the surface of the moon, and says words he had prepared carefully. The last human footprint is pressed into lunar dust. The hatch closes, and then for reasons that had everything to do with politics and money and shifting national priorities and almost nothing to do with capability, humanity simply stopped. What followed was 19,176 days of silence. In that time, the Berlin Wall fell. The internet was born, grew up, and rewired every aspect of human civilization. A company named Apple went from near bankruptcy to becoming the most valuable business in history. We sequenced the human genome. We landed rovers on Mars by bouncing them inside airbags. We built a permanent space station and kept people living in low Earth orbit continuously for over 20 years. We taught machines to recognize faces, translate languages, and generate images from pure text. And in all of that time, not one human being traveled beyond the invisible boundary sitting roughly 1,000 miles above Earth's surface. Not because we forgot how, but because we had not yet figured out how to do it in a way that was worth the cost of going back. Artemis II is the answer to that 53-year question. Here is something the Apollo program never fully solved and never truly had to. The human body was not designed for deep space. It was designed for this planet under this atmosphere, protected by a magnetic field that has been quietly deflecting lethal radiation for 4 billion years. The moment you leave that protection, biology starts losing a battle. It was never built to fight. The Van Allen belts are 2 enormous rings of charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field, sitting between roughly 636,000 miles above the surface. The International Space Station orbits safely below them at approximately 250 miles up. Every crewed mission since Apollo 17 in 1972 has stayed beneath those belts. The Artemis II crew punched through both of them on the way out and will punch through them again on the way home. Apollo astronauts did the same, but they moved fast, kept total mission time short, and operated with medical monitoring that, by today's standards, was essentially a checklist and a pulse reading. The average radiation dose across Apollo lunar missions was roughly 1.1 rem. That sounds manageable until you consider that we still do not fully understand what cumulative exposure to deep space radiation does to the human central nervous system over longer durations. Some researchers have raised questions about whether cosmic rays, the high-energy particles that stream in from outside our solar system, may interact with brain tissue in ways that current models do not completely capture. This is not settled science. It is an open question, and it is exactly the kind of open question that Artemis II is designed to begin closing. Every member of this crew is wearing a personal dosimeter that tracks radiation exposure in real time. Their cardiovascular data, sleep architecture, and circadian rhythms are being recorded continuously and transmitted back to Earth. The biological portrait being built from this mission will be unlike anything collected from Apollo. Consider what that data is actually for. NASA has already evaluated Orion within the framework of a hypothetical 1,000-day mission profile when paired with additional habitation modules. The journey to Mars and back, depending on orbital timing, runs somewhere between 500 and 900 days in deep space. The radiation exposure accumulated over that period represents one of the most significant unsolved problems in human spaceflight. Not engineering, not propulsion, biology. The Artemis II crew is not just testing a spacecraft. They are, in a very literal sense, serving as the first data points in the most important medical study in the history of exploration. Their bodies are the experiment. And right now, as you hear this, that experiment is running. There is a moment coming in this mission that no amount of technology can prevent. And understanding what leads up to it makes that moment far more significant than it might initially appear. Apollo talked to Houston using radio waves, the same fundamental technology as an AM station broadcasting traffic reports to commuters. It worked in the way that two cans connected by a string technically work. Audio was scratchy, bandwidth was narrow, and transmitting a single photograph back to Earth could take several minutes. The pipeline between the crew and the ground was essentially a trickle. Artemis II operates in an entirely different communications environment. The spacecraft carries laser optical communication capability as its primary high bandwidth system, with traditional radio as a backup. Laser communication in deep space works by firing an extraordinarily precise beam of light across hundreds of thousands of miles of vacuum and hitting a receiver the size of a dinner plate. If radio communication is shouting across a crowded room, laser communication is whispering directly into one specific ear from the other side of a continent. The bandwidth difference is not incremental. NASA's laser communications relay demonstration has shown throughput potential reaching into the gigabits per second range. That is sufficient to transmit high-definition video in real time from 250,000 miles away. Medical telemetry, piloting data, scientific readings, voice, video, all of it flowing continuously between the crew and Earth in a way that would have seemed like pure fiction to the engineers of 1968. And then it stops completely. When Artemis II passes behind the moon, every signal dies. No laser, no radio, no data link of any kind. For approximately 40 minutes, 4 human beings are more isolated than any person alive on Earth has ever been in recorded history. There is no frequency that bends around a planetary body. There is no workaround. The moon simply blocks everything. Apollo crews experienced this same silence, but they arrived at it after days of communicating through static and narrow bandwidth, so the transition was less dramatic. The Artemis II crew arrives at that silence after days of high-definition video calls and real-time data streaming. The psychological contrast between hyperconnection and absolute isolation, experienced in immediate succession, is something researchers have noted as genuinely unexplored territory. What those 40 minutes feel like from inside a capsule after days of crystal clear contact with Earth is a question that no amount of simulation on the ground can fully answer in advance. The crew will know, and what they report afterward will matter. There is a philosophy embedded inside every spacecraft ever built, and it tells you something fundamental about how much the people on the ground trust the people in the air. Apollo's philosophy was clear. The astronauts were extraordinarily capable human beings placed inside an extraordinarily capable machine that was nevertheless fundamentally dependent on Houston to function at its highest level. Mission Control made the critical navigational calculations. Mission Control monitored systems, identified anomalies, and issued corrective procedures. The crew executed with skill and courage, but the cognitive center of gravity for those missions sat in a building in Texas, not inside the capsule. Astronauts flew manually during specific well-defined phases, docking approaches, lunar landings, but the command module itself, moving through open space, was largely managed from the ground. Orion represents a deliberate philosophical reversal. The spacecraft runs 4 independent flight computers in parallel, each one roughly 25 times faster than the computers currently aboard the International Space Station. Artemis I, the uncrewed test flight in 2022, demonstrated that Orion could complete an entire lunar mission autonomously without a single human hand on the controls. Every system, every trajectory correction, every re-entry sequence managed entirely by the spacecraft itself. But autonomy without human mastery is just automation. What Artemis II is actually testing goes further. Reed Wiseman and Jeremy Hansen have been performing manual piloting demonstrations in deep space, physically flying Orion through different steering modes, evaluating how the vehicle handles under direct human input in ways that Apollo crews never did with their command module in open space. The reason this matters extends well beyond the moon. A radio signal traveling between Earth and Mars takes somewhere between 3 and 22 minutes to arrive, depending on where the two planets sit in their orbits. In a genuine emergency on the Martian surface, waiting 44 minutes for a round-trip communication exchange with Houston is not a delay. It is a death sentence. The crew must be capable of diagnosing, deciding, and acting entirely on their own. What Artemis II is building, one manual piloting demonstration at a time, is the foundation of a new relationship between astronauts and mission control. Less dependence, more authority, a shift from crew as highly skilled passengers toward crew as genuinely autonomous operators. That shift does not happen overnight. It happens exactly like this. One carefully documented test at a time, 250,000 miles from home. There is a conversation that happens before every crewed spaceflight that the public rarely hears in full. It is not a conversation about schedules or budgets or press conferences. It is a conversation about what is known, what is not known, and whether the gap between those two things is acceptable enough to put human beings on top of the rocket anyway. Before Artemis II launched, that conversation was more complicated than usual. When Artemis I returned from its uncrewed lunar mission in December of 2022, engineers examining the heat shield found something they did not expect. The ablative material, a substance called AV coat, designed to char and erode in a controlled way as it absorbs the brutal heat of re-entry, had not behaved entirely according to prediction. Portions of it had charred and flaked away in patterns the thermal models had not anticipated. The underlying structure of the shield remained intact. Temperatures inside the capsule stayed within acceptable limits. No single measurement crossed a line that would have indicated catastrophic failure. But the unexpected is never a comfortable finding in aerospace engineering. When your models tell you something will happen one way and reality produces something different, the honest response is not reassurance. It is investigation. NASA convened an independent review team and spent the better part of 2 years analysing what had happened and what it meant for a crewed flight. Some engineers argued that the anomaly required a fundamental redesign of the heat shield before any human being should be asked to trust their life to it. Others reviewed the same data and concluded that the structural integrity had held, that the thermal margins had held, and that the mission could proceed with the existing design while improvements were developed in parallel for Artemis III. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman reviewed the complete technical record, met with engineers and outside experts, and made the call. The heat shield flying on Artemis II is essentially the same design that flew on Artemis I. The changes are coming, but they are coming on the next mission. The crew knows this. They have read the reports. They have sat in rooms with the engineers who disagreed about what the data meant, and they chose to fly. This is the part of spaceflight that does not translate well into press releases or launch day celebrations. Every astronaut who has ever left the atmosphere has accepted a version of this same bargain. The engineering is not perfect. The margins are real, but not infinite. The models are the best available, not the best possible. And exploration by its nature requires a willingness to proceed into the space between what is known and what is not. History offers context here, though it must be handled carefully. The Apollo 1 fire in January of 1967 killed 3 astronauts on the ground during a routine test. NASA stopped for 18 months, redesigned the command module hatch, revised hundreds of procedures, and returned to flight. Challenger and Columbia each revealed systemic failures that the agency had to confront and rebuild around. Each tragedy produced knowledge that made subsequent missions safer. The Artemis II heat shield anomaly is not in the same category as those events. The shield did not fail. No one was harmed. But it raised a question that deserved a serious answer. And reasonable engineers looked at the same evidence and reached different conclusions about what that answer required. What this moment illustrates is something that tends to get lost in the spectacle of launch day. Spaceflight is not a solved problem dressed up in new hardware. It is an ongoing negotiation between ambition and uncertainty, managed by human beings who are doing their best with incomplete information under pressure, with consequences that are irreversible. The Artemis II crew understood that negotiation completely. They signed up for it anyway. That is not recklessness. That is the specific kind of courage that exploration has always required. Apollo was, in every measurable demographic sense, a program built by one kind of person and flown by one kind of person. White, male, American, drawn almost exclusively from the pipeline of military test pilots that existed in the 1960s. This was not, for the most part, the result of explicit policy decisions made with malicious intent. It was the result of a pipeline that had its own exclusions built in long before NASA ever began selecting astronauts. The program reflected the society that produced it, with all of the structural limitations that entailed. Artemis II does not erase that history. Nothing can, but the 4 people flying this mission represent something that the moon has not seen before. Victor Glover is the first person of color to travel beyond low Earth orbit in the history of human spaceflight. Christina Koch is the first woman. Jeremy Hansen is the first person who is not an American citizen, selected through the Artemis Accords framework, a series of bilateral agreements that by 2023 had been signed by 43 nations, formally internationalizing lunar exploration at the legal and operational level. And then there is the service module. The section of the spacecraft responsible for propulsion, thermal control, and life support was not built in the United States. It was designed and manufactured by Airbus Defence and Space in Bremen, Germany, contributed by the European Space Agency. The system keeping these 4 people alive was built on another continent by engineers from multiple nations under a framework of international cooperation that Apollo never required and never attempted. That is not a footnote. That is a fundamental change in what human spaceflight actually is. Right now, cosmic rays are passing through your body, roughly 10 high-energy particles every second, streaking through your skin, your organs, your brain, without you feeling a single one. Earth's magnetic field is deflecting the vast majority of what would otherwise reach you. You have lived your entire life inside that invisible shield without ever once having to think about it, because 4 billion years of planetary geology arranged things so that you would never need to. The 4 people on Artemis II do not have that luxury. Outside Earth's protective magnetic field, the particle environment changes in ways that human biology has never been asked to adapt to, because no pressure from natural selection has ever operated in deep space. Every cell in their bodies is processing an radiation environment that evolution across its entire 4 billion year history on this planet never prepared it for. The flashes of light that Apollo astronauts reported seeing with their eyes closed, cosmic rays striking directly against their retinas in the dark, were not hallucinations. They were the universe making itself physically felt inside the human nervous system. We know more about what causes those flashes now. We do not yet know everything those flashes mean over longer durations. That uncertainty is not abstract. It is biological. It is happening to 4 specific people right now in real time. And what their bodies record over the next 10 days will outlast this mission by decades. Artemis II does not land on the moon. That is Artemis III, currently scheduled for no earlier than 2026, though timelines in spaceflight have a well-documented tendency to shift. What Artemis II does is validate every system that Artemis III will depend on to actually put boots on the lunar surface for the first time since 1972. Beyond that, the roadmap extends further. The Lunar Gateway, a small space station designed to orbit the moon with modules contributed by multiple international partners, is intended to serve as a staging point for deeper exploration. Orion has already been evaluated within a hypothetical 1,000-day mission architecture when paired with additional habitation modules. The biological data being collected from this crew, their radiation exposure, cardiovascular response, sleep patterns, cognitive performance under sustained stress, will directly inform the mission duration limits and crew selection criteria for the first human journey to Mars. The Vera Rubin Observatory, beginning its full survey operations in 2026, will dramatically improve our understanding of the deep space environment that any Mars-bound crew will travel through. None of these timelines are guarantees. All of them are contingent on funding, political will, and the lessons that missions like Artemis II teach us about what we still do not know. But the direction is clear. The moon is no longer the destination. It is the first classroom. Tomorrow, the Artemis II crew will fly behind the moon. For 40 minutes, every signal dies. No laser, no radio, no voice from Earth, no data connection of any kind. Just 4 people in a metal capsule 250,000 miles from everything they have ever known, with nothing between them and the void except engineering and each other. The Apollo astronauts knew that silence too. It is the one experience that 53 years of technological progress has not changed and cannot change. The moon still blocks the signal. The darkness on the other side is still the same darkness. And for those 40 minutes, no amount of faster computers or smarter software or international cooperation makes any difference whatsoever. Apollo proved that human beings could leave. Artemis is learning how to stay gone long enough to matter. Everything this crew is testing, the radiation tolerance, the autonomous piloting, the laser communications, the flywheel, the heat shield, the biology, all of it points toward a single destination that no human being has yet reached. A planet that is, depending on the year, somewhere between 100 and 250 million miles away. We do not know yet if we can make that journey safely. Artemis II is how we begin finding out. The silence behind the moon is the same. Everything else is new.